I have always been intrigued by the stories of those intrepid individuals who suddenly forsake their mundane lives to seek greater purpose and meaning by way of a spiritual path. Moses was the adopted son of an Egyptian pharaoh until the day he was directed to lead a slave revolt by a voice speaking to him through a shrub on the side of a mountain. Jesus seems to have led an ordinary life for a West Asian peasant until he met John the Baptist in the wilderness and began to declare the dawning of a brand new world. Muhammad made his life as a caravan trader until he was summoned by the angel Jibril to receive the revelations of Allah while on retreat in the mountains outside of Mecca. Each of these encounters was profoundly altering, not only for the persons to whom they occurred, but also to the course of human history. Yet the call to adventure that I find most compelling is that of the spoiled prince who was later given the title Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama was the son of the ruler of a minor kingdom in present-day Nepal 2,500 years ago. On the day of his birth, his father consulted his court astrologers for guidance on how to prepare his son to succeed him as king. These seers were unanimous. Under no circumstance should Prince Siddhartha be allowed to experience anything unpleasant, lest it upset his sensitive nature and he give up the path to kingship to pursue a more spiritually meaningful life. The words of his advisors were taken to heart by the king, and he effectively imprisoned his son, not allowing him outside the palace walls, ensuring that he ate only the best food, socialized with the most attractive people, wore the finest silks, and never experienced anything not to his liking. But despite his father's zealous overprotection, Siddhartha escaped his gilded cage at the age of 29 and came to see what the world was really like. In short order, he came upon a person racked with illness, another suffering from old age, and then the greatest shock of all, a lifeless corpse. With each encounter, he stopped to ask his companion, "What's wrong with this person?" And each time, he was told that what he experienced was part of the common lot of all human beings. Incredulous, the prince persisted. "Do you mean these things are going to happen to my parents, to my wife, to my child?" "Yes," he was told. "Will they happen to me?" "They will happen to you and to everyone you love," came the reply. That evening, the young man renounced all that he had and began his quest to ease his troubled spirit. The account of the distressed prince who gave up everything to find an end to suffering was so enthralling that 1,000 years later, his story was adopted by Christians as one of their own. In the Christian retelling, Siddhartha became Prince Buddhasaph, which was later changed to the more biblical sounding Josaphat. Josaphat was born the son of an Indian king who was renowned for his cruel persecution of Christians in his realm. Fearing that his son might convert to Christianity, the king sequestered Josaphat in a palace of pleasures to make certain that did not happen. Nevertheless, one evening, the son stealthily escaped his father's house and ultimately became a Christian. Years later, according to the Christian version, Josaphat returned to the palace and convinced his father to abdicate the throne and follow Christ. For his faith and bravery, Josaphat was eventually canonized by the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Thus, in one of the many ironies in the history of religion, the Buddha became a Christian saint. That's how compelling the story of Prince Siddhartha has been to so many. Yet, despite its captivating nature, the story used to bother me somewhat. Now, I can make sense of the rather far-fetched idea that an overprotective father would try to keep his son locked up to shield him from life's darker sides. As a father myself, I know there's part of me that would love nothing more than to prevent my beloved daughter from having to face the hardships of life. But what really troubled me about the story of Siddhartha was the fact that he was 29 years old before he discovered the hard facts of sickness, old age, and death. I mean, really? 29? What? He never saw his grandparents? Never even had a cold? Never lost a goldfish? It was always difficult for me to accept this part of the story until I reached that age myself. I was around 29 or 30, give or take, that one day I looked into the mirror and observed for the first time clear indications that I was aging. I so vividly remember the horror. I mean, I knew aging was a thing. I just didn't think it happened to me. Somehow, I always thought an exception would be made in my case. Of course, as I often do when something unwanted appears in my life, I tried to deny the evidence of my eyes. It took me quite a while to accept the fact that I was getting older and that my body and appearance were reflecting that process. Suddenly, the story of the Buddha's realization at 29 made sense to me. The tale was not so much a literal account of what happened to Siddhartha Gautama. Rather, it was a mythic conveyance of what on some level can happen to us all. As young people, we learn at a relatively early age that humans are subject to illness, aging, death. But what we often fail to grasp in an existential way is that those things can happen to us. I think this is what befell the man who became the Buddha. No doubt the historical Siddhartha knew about the unpleasant facts of life before the age of 29. But somewhere along the line, and maybe it was the age 29, but somewhere he came to see that he himself was not exempt from the laws that govern life. The abstract and remote now unexpectedly became personal and real. And the real was appalling enough to throw him off course and set him on a new path. Because of its disturbing and disruptive quality, many of us try our best to prevent our personal infirmities, and ultimate demise from coming to complete awareness. In his sobering novella, The Death of Ivan Illich, Leo Tolstoy demonstrates how we tend to fool ourselves when the frailties of life come near. After he receives word that his close friend, Ivan Illich, had died, Pyotr Ivanovich momentarily lets the news upset him and then quickly reasons it away. Tolstoy tells us Pyotr Ivanovich was overcome with horror as he thought of the suffering of someone he had known so well. First as a carefree boy, then as a schoolmate, and later as a grown man. He thought for a moment and felt panic-stricken. Why, the same thing could happen to me at any time now. But at once, and he himself did not know how, he was rescued by the customary reflection that this happened to Ivan Illich, not to him. That it could not and should not happen to him. And that if he were to grant such a possibility, he would succumb to depression. With this line of reasoning, Pyotr Ivanovich set his mind at rest and began to press for details about Ivan Illich's death, as if death were a chance experience that could only happen to Ivan Illich, never to himself. With great insight, Tolstoy masterfully reveals how our minds often function to keep us from thinking too much about our own finitude. In one of the pivotal passages of the Mahabharata, the great foundational epic of India, Yudhishthira, one of the central characters, is confronted by a demon and is required to answer this question: what is the most astonishing thing in the world? Without hesitation, Yudhishthira replies, the most astonishing thing in the world is that every moment thousands of living beings meet death, but people think and act as if they will live forever. Not only do we disguise the reality of death as individuals, we do it collectively. As a culture, we conceal our finitude as much as possible. We try to mask any sign of the aging process that might suggest to ourselves or to others that we are inching closer to our inevitable end. And yet, as that inevitability draws near, we sometimes attempt to keep it at bay by prolonging life with medical technology, often choosing to ignore the diminished quality of life that such technology brings. When at last death arrives, we might experience it as a defeat rather than as a natural stage of living. And then to further estrange us from the reality of death, we turn over the dead to commercial undertakers who take care of every aspect of disposing of the body so we don't have to. Long gone are the days where families in this country would bring the dead into their own homes to take care of the remains and come to terms with death in their own individual ways. Removing death from our midst and disguising its approach has further contributed to our fear of it, thus mystifying death and leaving us unprepared for its inevitability. But in contrast to this alienation from our mortality, The world's spiritual and philosophical traditions suggest that contemplating death is not only liberating, but essential to living a full and satisfying life. Finitude itself can be one of the greatest teachers for living. The French essayist Montaigne writes, "Let us deprive death of its strangeness. Let us frequent it. Let us get used to it. Let us have nothing more often in mind than death. We do not know where death awaits us, so let us wait for it everywhere." To practice death is to practice freedom. A person who has learned to die has unlearned to be a slave. By fully accepting the inevitability of death, we come to greater clarity about what is important in life. My closest friend died 25 years ago. After a long struggle with AIDS. About a year before he died, he told me his illness had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. I was shaken by that claim. I'd watched him degenerate from a healthy young man to a frail shadow, little more than a breathing corpse. He explained that knowing that his death was imminent and certain freed his mind from playing its usual games and permitted him to concentrate his attention on appreciating the beauty of life and the warmth of his friends. Had it not been for his disease, he would have easily frittered away his existence bit by bit, squandering the precious gift of life that he had been given. Now, though the length of his days had been greatly foreshortened, he could die knowing that his life had not been a waste. In the light of death, trivialities begin to fall away. The Buddha tells us that acceptance of our common finitude has the potential to bring us together and put our disputes in perspective. The Buddha said, "Those who fight with one another have forgotten that we all die. But for the wise, who truly know this fact, there are no quarrels." Because we sometimes forget that our lives are transitory, we are prone to struggle over matters that are of little consequence. When we hold before our minds the inevitability of death, we recognize that such inconsequential things are simply not worth the fight. 2 weeks ago, we welcomed the season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to the celebration of Easter. Traditionally, Lent is a time of self-reflection and contemplation, a time of quiet and sobriety. It's quite fitting that many Christians start this period with the imposition of ashes, fashioned in the shape of a cross. Both the form and substance of this emblem point to the importance of acknowledging our finitude. So important that we even wear it on our faces to remind ourselves and the whole world. Ashes recall the words of Jehovah upon expelling Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. "You are dust, and to dust you will return." These were not words of condemnation, but a simple statement of fact. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, says the Book of Common Prayer, to remind us of our earthly nature. The image of the cross points not only to the death of Jesus, but to our own as well. As the Apostle Paul writes in the letter to the Romans, all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death. Our anticipation of Jesus' death on the cross on Good Friday should therefore entail the contemplation of our own finite natures. What better time to contemplate our mortality than now? During this season of self-examination, let us take to heart these fundamental realities of our existence. That we're subject to sickness, aging, and death. That being finite means a limitation to what we can know and to what we can do. For this season, let us consider these facts as clearly and as thoroughly as we can. Perhaps then, we might wake up on Easter Sunday and again recall the words of Paul, "For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his."
Please stand. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God.